Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. JLam Bio here. We are going to finish up our evolution unit today by talking about different modes of evolution. So, in what ways can evolution and natural selection occur? What type of things can cause that to happen? We're going to dive into that today and talk a little bit about some differences within species and how those differences come about and what that means for the future of a variety of different species. So we've got a couple key objectives here. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand and explain a wide variety of ways that allele frequencies can change in a population over time, which we already know is just kind of the main idea of evolution and natural selection. You should also be able to evaluate situations involving natural selection and predict the potential outcome based on the environment. And lastly, we should be able to explore how species change and evolve over time. We got a couple new vocabulary terms for this particular video. We will talk about gene pool, directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. We'll talk about the process of speciation, bottleneck effect, founder effect, convergent and divergent evolution, and coevolution. So keep in mind the whole time we've been talking about evolution, we've been talking about changes that occur within the gene pool. Now the gene pool is the amount of different alleles in a population. Keep in mind that due to natural selection and evolution, this can change based on the traits that prove to be beneficial in an environment. Those with traits that are beneficial are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring. So as a result, we see more of those genes in future generations. So I do want you to keep in mind that it truly is all about the environment. So when we look at the distribution of alleles, normal distribution is the frequency is highest in the middle and lowest towards the individual extreme. So for example, human height is an excellent example. Human height is most frequently somewhere in the middle. People aren't too short, people aren't too tall. That's not to say there aren't short and tall people in this world, but more individuals are going to fall in that normal range, say, I don't know, 5'6" to 6'2", than people who are smaller than that or people who are taller than that. Now again, that depends on a variety of different factors. That may depend on the sex of the individual. That can depend on in a lot of ways ethnicities and things like that. But keep in mind that normal distribution frequency is highest towards the middle. So how can that change? Well, for example, we look at something called directional selection, and this is the change in the gene pool that favors one particular extreme of the trait. So one example of that would be the giraffe neck. The giraffe evolved a long neck because it allowed them to get more food. More food is an advantageous trait, which allowed those with tall necks to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring. So as a result, giraffes have tall necks over time. Same thing with drug-resistant bacteria. That particular gene provides an advantage. It allows them to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on. So directional selection favors one extreme of a trait. Another example is stabilizing selection, and this favors the intermediate. That is, it favors those that are in the middle. So one example would be spider size. Small spiders are so small that they don't have the ability to get the food that they need to be able to survive. Large spiders are easily seen by predators, and as a result, they're the ones that are eaten. But spiders that are in the middle, that have that average size, are big enough to be able to get the food they need to eat, and yet small enough to where they're not going to be able to be seen as easily by predators. So stabilizing selection favors the intermediate. They survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring, resulting in a large amount of genes that favor the intermediate or middle. The last one is disruptive selection, and this favors both extremes. So this typically is something that favors multiple different traits. This often results in speciation, rise of two species from one existing one. So if we take a look at the diagram on the right here, there's something in the gene pool that the genes on both extremes are favored. And so as a result, you see those occurring time and time again. Now that median, that middle part, is going to go all the way down. Eventually what you end up with two separate populations with two separate gene pools, and eventually they're no longer able to reproduce within one another. Their genes become so different that they can no longer have viable offspring. As a result of that, we end up with two separate yet similar species to one another. An example of this is butterfly patterns. Maybe one particular extreme of a butterfly pattern is beneficial and on the opposite side, another extreme is beneficial, while those that have the one particular pattern that's in the middle is selected against. So what happens is that those populations with favored traits survive and reproduce, and then eventually become two completely separate populations, resulting in two separate species of butterflies. So some other concepts related to evolution and natural selection. The concept of convergent evolution. To converge kind of means to come together. And this is why species evolve similar traits due to similar environments, or as we've talked about, analogous structures. The shark, the ichthyosaur, and the dolphin all have fins because they're well adapted to their environment. They're adapted to their environment because they have fins which allow them to swim. Yet as you can see, one is a reptile, one is a fish, and one is a mammal. So they come from very different backgrounds. So they don't really share common ancestry. Divergent evolution is closely related species that evolve in different directions while adapting to different environments. So for example, to diverge means to break off into separate directions from one particular point. So the example of this, we have a cat common ancestor. Genetic variation over time resulted in some changes, and you can see we have a variety of different cats that are well adapted to many different environments. So keep in mind the difference between convergent and divergent. Divergent evolution really explains homologous structures, whereas convergent evolution gives a good explanation for analogous structures. The concept of coevolution is something we have already talked a little bit about, is that species evolve together in response to changes in each other. So you see this flower here, and you see this bird. This bird has developed this uniquely shaped beak in order to access the food that is inside of the flower. Well, the flower doesn't really like that. They need the pollen to be able to reproduce. So those that have flowers or stems that don't allow the bird to access it are better adapted to their environment. They survive and reproduce, and so you see the unique shape of the flower. Well, the birds that have the unique beaks that allow them to get into the newly formed unique shaped flower will survive and reproduce. So both of these organisms are evolving in conjunction with each other. As one changes, so does the other. Again, it's all about the environment. It's all about the other species that they are living with, and they are adapting to one another through the process of coevolution. A couple of other factors that promote speciation or changes in species, behavioral isolation is one, and that requires different mating rituals. So for example, the eastern and western meadowlarks, very, very similar birds as you can see, but they will not mate with each other because their signals to attract mates differ between those species. The songs that they sing in order to attract mates is very different from one another. Another example is geographic isolation. As time passes, geography changes. Now keep in mind this takes place over thousands and millions of years. But as the geography changes, so do the species' ability to reproduce with one another. And if there's a geographical barrier between two separate populations, that can result in speciation of those different populations. And then the last one is temporal isolation, where we have different breeding seasons. Some organisms breed during different times of the year, and as a result, they cannot reproduce with one another. A couple of the ways that the gene pool can change, this is a little bit more of a different situation. We've been talking about natural selection quite a bit, where those with traits best suited to the environment are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on. Well, here we have an example known as the bottleneck effect. Now, this is an event that causes most individuals in a population to die, and those that just happen to survive purely by chance. So it's called a bottleneck because if you look at the example on the right here, you have an original population with a variety of different genes in it. That's what the different beads represent. And a catastrophic event reduces the population. So we tip the bottle over, and randomly a few of the beads fall out. Those that are survive, reproduce, and pass their traits on. So notice in the new population, we don't have any of the red or green anymore. That change in genes, that change in alleles is a result of that catastrophic event. Those that survive by chance, and they get to survive, reproduce, and pass their traits on. So it's a really, really interesting concept to kind of think about this in terms of, in contrast with natural selection. So do keep that in mind. The other one is known as the founder effect, and that's just when a new population branches off. So sometimes a new population will form due to a geographic barrier or something along those lines. it's very similar to the bottleneck effect. The selection is completely random. So those that it's not necessarily about what traits are advantageous to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on. It's about who just happenly randomly survives, and as a result, you see those genes as the dominant genes in the future populations. So natural selection can occur in a variety of different ways. Evolution can lead to speciation, but there are other ways that can lead to speciation as well, such as the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. The focus of natural selection is solely on the environment. Traits that are best suited to the environment provide an advantage for an organism, and it allows it to better survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to their offspring, which can shift the frequency in genes over time. So a lot going on in this video. I didn't necessarily mention the word of the video. I'll pop one in here in just a little bit, but hopefully we've met the objectives for you guys today. I hope you have a fantastic day. It's the last part of Revolution Unit. We'll move on to classification next, and then we are going to start in ecology. Hope you guys have a great day. We will talk to you later. Peace out.